The frost clung to the window panes like a shroud, turning the grand plantation house into a ghostly silhouette against the pale dawn of Christmas morning. In the heart of Georgia's backcountry, where the pines whispered secrets to the wind, Master Harlan Whitaker stirred in his four-poster bed, the air thick with the scent of hickory smoke and something sharper, more primal, the faint tang of impending doom. He had always prided himself on his iron rule over the 23 souls bound to his land, their backs bent under the weight of cotton fields that stretched like endless graves toward the shadowy woods beyond. But this morning, as the first light pierced the gloom, an unnatural silence hung over the quarters, broken only by the distant call of a crow, as if the very earth held its breath. Down in the dim-lit kitchen, figures moved with deliberate slowness, their eyes gleaming with a fire that no overseer's whip could extinguish. Eliza, the eldest among them, her hands scarred from years of toil, stirred a pot over the hearth, her murmurs blending with the crackle of flames. Today, she breathed to the others, the chains break. The group, men, women, even the young ones hardened beyond their years, nodded in unison, their faces masks of quiet fury. They had endured the beatings, the separations, the endless nights of hollow promises from a man who saw them as less than the livestock in his barns. But whispers had come in the dark weeks leading up, voices drifting from the woods like smoke, speaking of justice, of blood repaid in kind. As the sun crept higher, casting long shadows across the frost-kissed lawn, Harlan rose, pulling on his finest coat, expecting the usual servile offerings of the holiday. The table was set with care, steaming biscuits, glazed ham, a decanter of his favorite whiskey glinting in the light. He settled into his chair at the head, a smug smile curling his lips, unaware that the eyes watching him from the corners held not deference, but the cold gleam of predators sizing up their prey. Outside, the woods loomed, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, and from within their depths, the voices stirred again, soft at first, then insistent, weaving through the air like threads of fog. They called not just to the enslaved, but to something older, buried deep in the soil of this cursed land, waiting for the spark that would ignite a horror no one in Georgia could have foreseen. The door creaked open, and the first of the 23 entered, tray in hand, their steps measured, hearts pounding with the rhythm of retribution. Harlan raised his glass in a mocking toast, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. But as the morning unfolded, the air grew heavier, charged with an electric tension that prickled the skin, and the voices from the woods swelled, promising that this Christmas would etch itself into the annals of terror, a mystery unfolding in the dark heart of the wilds where no light dared penetrate. In the waning hours of Christmas Eve, 1859, a bitter wind swept through the low country of Georgia, rattling the thin walls of the slave quarters on Harlan Whitaker's isolated plantation. Nestled deep in a sea of whispering pines and tangled undergrowth, the Whitaker estate lay miles from the nearest neighbor, its fields blanketed in frost that glimmered faintly under a sliver of moon. Inside the cramped cabins, where cracks in the boards let the cold seep in like fingers, 23 enslaved men, women, and children huddled close around dying embers. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and the lingering smoke of cornbread baked earlier under watchful eyes. 4 years, Harlan Whitaker had ruled with a cruelty that went beyond the ordinary brutality of the lash. He delighted in breaking spirits as much as bodies, separating mothers from children at auctions, working the weak until they collapsed in the rows, and reserving his most vicious moods for holidays when others softened. Christmas was no exception. It was merely another day to remind them of their place. This year, however, something had shifted in the quiet hours after supper. The usual resigned silence that followed the master's retirement to his grand house gave way to murmurs, low and deliberate, passing from bunk to bunk like sparks along dry tinder. Eliza, the eldest at 52, her back a map of old scars, sat on a splintered crate and spoke first. Her voice was soft yet carried the weight of decades. She reminded them of little Amos, sold away last spring though he was barely 10, of Ruth, whipped near to death for spilling coffee on the master's table, of Jonah, who had vanished into the swamp after a failed escape, his screams echoing in their dreams. Each name drew a nod, a tightening of jaws, a spark in eyes dulled by exhaustion. Around her, the others leaned in strong field hands like Gabriel and Silas, whose muscles had been forged in endless toil, young Delilah, quick with a knife and quicker with rage, even quiet Thomas, the blacksmith, whose hands could bend iron and now clenched into fists. They did not speak of freedom in grand terms. They spoke of ending the terror that walked their days in polished boots. The plan was simple, born of necessity and whispered over weeks. Christmas morning, when Whittaker would be heavy with drink and expectation, they would act together. No one would be left to face the consequences alone. As the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows across determined faces, the wind outside carried a strange hush through the pines, as if the woods themselves listened. Hands clasped briefly in the dark, a silent pact sealed amid the creaking timbers. When the last ember faded, they lay down not to sleep, but to wait for dawn, hearts beating with a rhythm older than chains, a rhythm of rebellion gathering like storm clouds over the frozen fields. As the plantation clock struck midnight on Christmas Eve, the wind died abruptly, leaving an unnatural stillness that pressed against the cabins like a held breath. The 23 conspirators, still awake and coiled with tension from their whispered pact, felt the change at once. Fires had burned down to glowing coals, casting faint red light across the rough-hewn walls, when the first sound came not from within the quarters, but from the black wall of pines that ringed the fields. It began as a murmur, barely distinguishable from the rustle of dead leaves, yet it carried words, fragmented and ancient, drifting through the cracks in the planks. The voices were low, layered, as if many throats spoke at once from deep in the earth. Some heard their own names spoken softly, tenderly, the way a mother might call a child home. Others caught snatches of older tongues, syllables that prickled the skin and tightened the chest. Eliza froze with her shawl half pulled around her shoulders, eyes wide, listening as the chorus swelled and ebbed like distant waves. Gabriel, strongest of the field hands, rose silently and moved to the door, pressing his ear to the wood. The sound grew clearer out there, sibilant, insistent, threading through the frost-laden branches. He saw nothing when he cracked the door open, only darkness and the glint of starlight on iced needles, yet the voices wrapped around him, promising strength, promising that the blood debt would be paid before sunrise. A shiver ran through his broad frame, not entirely from cold. Young Delilah clutched the small charm of knotted twine at her throat, whispering that these were the ancestors, come at last to guide their hands. Thomas, the blacksmith, shook his head slowly, muttering that no spirit he knew spoke with such hunger in its tone. The voices seemed to answer him directly then, rising in a sudden gust that rattled the tin roof and sent sparks swirling up the chimney. They spoke of chains snapping, of earth drinking deep, of a reckoning long overdue. Fear and exhilaration mingled in the cramped space. Some fell to their knees, lips moving in silent plea or gratitude. Others stood taller, as though the words poured iron into their spines. The chorus never shouted, it coaxed, it urged, it remembered every lash, every cry torn from the fields. It knew Harlan Whittaker's footsteps on the veranda, knew the weight of his keys, knew the hour when his guard would be lowest. And beneath the encouragement ran a darker current, a note of satisfaction that chilled even as it emboldened. By the time the voices faded, receding into the woods like smoke, the conspirators sat in profound silence, faces gleaming with sweat despite the cold. The embers had settled into dull ash, yet the room felt charged, alive with something vast and watchful. Dawn was only hours away, and the pines stood sentinel, their branches swaying though no wind stirred them now. As the first pale streaks of Christmas morning bled across the Georgia sky in 1859, the plantation stirred with a deceptive calm. Frost silvered the cotton stubble in the fields, and thin ribbons of smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, carrying the rich aromas of baking biscuits, sizzling fatback, and spiced ham that Harlan Whittaker demanded each holiday. Inside the detached cookhouse, the 23 moved with practiced grace, their hands steady despite the fire roaring in their veins from the midnight voices. Eliza stood at the center, directing the preparations with quiet authority. Platters were arranged with deliberate care, golden cornbread stacked high, gravy thickened to perfection, a gleaming ham studded with cloves. Bowls of collards glistened with pot liquor, and a towering sweet potato pie cooled on the sill, its cinnamon scent drifting through the open door. To any overseer glancing in, it would appear the usual ritual of forced festivity, the enslaved offering their labor as tribute to a master who gave nothing in return. Yet every motion carried hidden purpose. Delilah measured sorghum into the master's private decanter with a steady hand, her eyes flicking to Gabriel as he crushed dried herbs between calloused fingers and let the powder drift unseen into the whiskey's amber depths. The mixture was slow and subtle, roots gathered in secret from the wood's edge, known to elders for dulling the mind and loosening the limbs while leaving the drinker boastful and unaware. Silas buttered the biscuits with extra care, slipping thin shavings of another pale root between the layers, its bitterness masked by honey drizzled warm from the pot. The younger ones carried wood to keep the hearth blazing, their faces composed even as their hearts hammered. Thomas shaped dough for extra loaves, pressing tiny seeds into the undersides that would bloom hours later in the belly. No one spoke above a murmur, but glances passed like sparks, confirmation, warning, shared resolve. The kitchen grew warmer, steam fogging the small windows, blending with the haze of righteous fury that thickened the air. Outside, the great house loomed silent, its white columns stark against the dawn. Whitaker would rise soon, expecting his holiday indulgence served with downcast eyes and soft voices. The table in the dining room had been set the night before, silver polished to a cold gleam, crystal decanter waiting, a single chair pulled out at the head like a throne. The enslaved knew his habits well. He would eat alone at first, gorging while the whiskey flowed, growing louder and more careless with each glass before summoning them for his mocking toasts. As the sun lifted clear of the pines, casting long shadows across the yard, the final dishes were loaded onto trays. The aromas curled invitingly toward the big house, a siren's call wrapped in sweetness and smoke. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, her scarred fingers lingering a moment on the edge of a carving knife before sliding it beneath a folded cloth. The others gathered the platters, faces smooth as polished stone, breaths measured. The feast was ready, beautiful and deadly, a gift that promised the master the deepest sleep he had ever known, while the woods beyond the fields waited in patient silence, their ancient voices now quiet but watchful as the sun climbed higher on Christmas morning, casting pale light through the lace curtains of the great house. Harlan Whitaker sat alone at his polished mahogany table, his plate heaped with the lavish spread prepared by hands he believed were forever subservient. The ham glistened, the biscuits steamed, and the whiskey poured freely into his crystal glass, its amber glow catching the firelight as he drank deeply, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. His cheeks flushed with indulgence, his voice already thick as he muttered boasts to the empty room about the bounty of his land and the obedience of his property. The poison worked slowly, as intended, a dullness creeping into his limbs, a pleasant haze softening the edges of his thoughts. He called out in a slurred command for the usual holiday performance, expecting the enslaved to file in with bowed heads and forced smiles. The heavy door to the dining room swung open, but no single servant entered. Instead, all 23 stepped inside together, moving as one shadow across the threshold. They filled the room in silence, trays lowered, eyes lifted, faces no longer masked by deference. Whitaker blinked, confusion flickering through the fog in his mind. He straightened in his chair, the familiar scowl forming as he demanded to know why they dared crowd his presence unbidden. Eliza stepped forward first, her scarred hands clasped before her, voice steady and low. She spoke his name, not master, not sir, just Harlan, as though tasting something bitter. Then the others joined, their voices rising in a measured chorus that echoed off the high ceilings and crystal chandeliers. One by one, they named the cruelties he had inflicted. Gabriel recounted the day his wife was sold south. Delilah spoke of the night her infant was taken for crying too long. Silas remembered the branding iron pressed to his shoulder for a whispered prayer. Thomas described the weight of chains forged in his own smithy and locked around his brother's ankles. Each voice layered upon the last, calm but unrelenting, painting a litany of suffering that filled the room like smoke. Whitaker tried to rise, his hand groping for the bell to summon the overseer, but his legs betrayed him, heavy as wet cotton. His shouts came out muffled, slurred, impotent. The circle tightened. Faces he had never truly looked upon now stared back without fear, eyes burning with a cold, clear fire. The air grew thick, charged with the weight of years compressed into this single moment. Outside, the pines stood motionless, yet the faint memory of midnight voices seemed to linger in the corners, watching, waiting. Whitaker's glass slipped from his slack fingers, shattering against the floor in a spray of whiskey and crystal. For the first time in his life, the man who had believed himself untouchable felt the chill of true power turned against him, the realization dawning slowly through the haze that he was no longer the one who commanded silence. The chorus continued, unbroken, inexorable, each word a link in the chain now closing around his throat. The dining room fell silent as Harlan Whitaker's body slumped forward, his head striking the table with a dull thud that scattered silverware and sent red wine bleeding across the white cloth. For a heartbeat, the 23 stood motionless, staring at the man who had loomed over their lives like a storm cloud now reduced to lifeless weight. Then Eliza moved first, pressing 2 fingers to his neck, feeling nothing but cooling skin. A low exhale rippled through the group, part relief, part terror at the finality of what they had done. There was no time for lingering. Gabriel and Silas lifted the body from the chair, wrapping it swiftly in the heavy damask tablecloth, blood already soaking through in dark blossoms. Delilah snatched the carving knife from beneath her apron and sliced the ropes that bound the curtains, fashioning crude slings to carry their burden. Thomas doused the hearth fire with the remaining whiskey, the sharp scent rising to mask the copper tang of death. They worked in practiced silence, every motion rehearsed in whispered midnight plans. The back door creaked as they slipped out into the crisp Christmas air, the frost-crusted grass crunching softly under bare feet and worn boots. The great house receded behind them, its windows dark now, as though the building itself had closed its eyes in shock. Ahead lay the tree line, the pines rising like a black wall against the pale sky, their branches heavy with ice that glinted faintly in the strengthening light. The group moved quickly across the open yard, the bundled body swaying between Gabriel and Silas, leaving a faint trail of crimson droplets that steamed briefly before freezing. As they reached the edge of the woods, the air changed, thicker, colder, carrying the sharp resin of pine and something older, earthier. The voices that had visited them at midnight returned, no longer distant murmurs but closer, threading through the trunks like fingers brushing bark. They urged haste, deeper, deeper, promising concealment in shadows no patrol would dare follow. The fugitives pressed on, branches snagging at clothing, needles scraping skin, the weight of their deed growing heavier with every step. The path narrowed, the canopy closing overhead until only thin blades of sunlight pierced the gloom. Frost gave way to damp leaf mold that muffled their footfalls. Breath plumed white in the chill, hearts pounding in unison as the plantation fell away behind them. The voices grew layered again, some soothing, some eager, guiding them along a trail none had known existed, an ancient deer path winding toward places the maps in Whitaker's study had never marked. Thorns tore at sleeves, roots tripped weary legs, yet they pushed forward, driven by the twin fires of terror and triumph. Deeper still, the woods seemed to swallow sound itself, the distant world reduced to the rasp of breath and the soft thud of the bundle against tree trunks. The pines leaned close, their trunks scarred with old blazes no axe had made, and the air hummed with watchful presence. The 23 fled into that waiting dark, carrying death behind them and an unknown fate ahead, the voices rising in a low, ceaseless welcome that wrapped around their fleeing forms like vines claiming new ground. The woods had swallowed them whole by late afternoon, the faint trail of blood long frozen behind as the 23 pressed deeper into the tangle of pine and briar. The bundled body grew heavier with every mile, the tablecloth stiff with ice and staining darker, but they dared not set it down. Breath came in ragged plumes, legs burned from the uneven ground, yet the voices that had guided them earlier now fell silent, leaving only the crack of twigs and the distant, mournful call of a barred owl long before dusk. Isaac, the youngest among the men at barely 19, had carried the rear since leaving the plantation yard. His eyes, wide and restless, darted constantly to the shadows between trunks, as though expecting the overseer's ghost to step out with rifle raised. The midnight chorus had stirred something different in him, guilt rather than fire. He had been Harlan Whitaker's house boy once, favored with scraps from the table and lighter duties, a position that bred resentment among the others even as it spared him the worst of the lash. Now, with the master dead by their hands, the weight of that old favor twisted in his gut like a blade. As the group paused in a small hollow to shift the burden from weary shoulders, Isaac lingered at the edge, staring back the way they had come. The plantation was miles behind now, yet he could still smell the whiskey on Whitaker's breath, hear the slurred commands. Freedom lay north, they said, beyond the rivers and patrols, but the voices had promised no such thing, only blood and deeper shadows. His hands trembled as he clutched the small burlap sack of cornbread meant to sustain them. The others spoke in low tones of pressing on before nightfall, of finding the hidden spring Eliza claimed lay ahead. Without a word, Isaac slipped away, stepping lightly over roots and fallen branches, moving back along their broken trail. His plan was fragile: reach the nearest farm by dawn, claim he had been forced into the deed, beg mercy in exchange for leading the militia to the others. White men would believe a terrified boy over field hands, he told himself, and perhaps spare him the noose. Fear drove his feet faster, heart hammering as the woods closed behind him. He had gone no more than 100 yards when the air shifted again, growing heavier, the light dimming though the sun still hung above the canopy. The voices returned, not the layered chorus of midnight, but a single thread, low and intimate, speaking his name with a tenderness that chilled his blood. Branches stirred though no wind blew. Footsteps that were not his own rustled leaves to his left, then right. Isaac froze, breath catching, as shapes flickered at the edge of vision, tall, thin, gone when he turned. He ran then, stumbling over roots, thorns tearing his sleeves, but the path seemed to twist, carrying him in circles. The voices multiplied, whispering of betrayal, of debts unpaid, of a boy who had eaten from the master's hand now fleeing the reckoning. Darkness gathered unnaturally fast, shadows pooling like ink. When the others, noticing his absence, called his name into the gloom, no answer came, only a sudden, sharp cry cut short, echoing once through the pines before silence reclaimed the woods. By the time Gabriel and Silas doubled back with a pine knot torch, the trail ended in scuffed earth and a single scrap of burlap, the cornbread scattered and already dusted with frost. Isaac was gone, as though the forest had simply closed over him, leaving the remaining 22 alone with the growing dread that something ancient walked beside them now, hungry for more than one man's blood. Night had claimed the woods fully by the time the 22 survivors stumbled into a clearing none of them had ever seen, though some swore the land felt familiar in the bone-deep way of old nightmares. The pines parted abruptly, revealing a wide circle of ground where no trees grew, only low mounds choked with ivy and pale lichen that glowed faintly under moonlight. In the center rose broken stones, crumbled walls half sunk into the earth, their surfaces carved with symbols worn smooth by centuries of rain and wind. The air here was warmer, unnaturally so, carrying the scent of turned soil and something metallic, like blood long dried. Exhaustion forced them to stop. Gabriel and Silas lowered the bundled body at last, laying it beside a fallen slab veined with dark quartz. Breath steamed in the stillness as the group gathered close, eyes adjusting to the strange luminescence that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Eliza knelt first, brushing aside leaves to reveal more of the carvings, spirals, eyes, hands raised in supplication or warning. The stones formed the remnants of a low platform, perhaps an altar once, ringed by shallow depressions that might have been fire pits or graves. As fingers traced the etchings, the voices returned not from the treetops now, but from beneath their feet, rising through root and rock in a resonant hum that vibrated in teeth and chest. Shapes coalesced in the mist that pooled ankle-deep, translucent figures, tall and elongated, their faces indistinct yet sorrowful. They wore no chains, yet their movements suggested bondage, wrists crossed as though long accustomed to iron. One by one, the apparitions turned toward the bundled corpse, heads tilting in recognition. Delilah gasped as understanding flooded her. These were not the ancestors she had prayed to in the quarters. These were older people who had worked this land before the Whitakers, before the cotton, before the ships. Their tongues spoke a language lost to time, yet meaning poured directly into the listeners' minds, images of rituals broken, of blood offered and then withheld, of a bargain struck with something vast and patient beneath the soil. The plantation's wealth, its isolation, its cruelty all rooted here, fed by generations of suffering poured into the earth like libation. The spectral figures gestured toward the carvings, revealing how the first Whitaker had disturbed this place, building his house upon cursed ground, binding the land's hunger to his own greed. Each lash, each sale, each death had been payment, keeping the entity below sated. But now the debt had reversed. The voices swelled, showing visions of Harlan's blood soaking into the tablecloth, into the frost, into the clearing itself, a final offering that awakened what had slept. Some of the fugitives recoiled, whispering of leaving this place before dawn. Others, Thomas among them, stared transfixed as the apparitions reached out, not in threat but invitation, promising that the power once used against them could now serve their flight. The clearing pulsed with energy, stones warm to the touch, ivy writhing slowly as though alive. The 22 stood divided between terror and temptation, the body at their feet already sinking slightly into the soft earth, as spectral hands guided it deeper, claiming what was owed, while the voices rose in a chorus that shook loose frost from the surrounding pines and filled the night with the weight of secrets finally unearthed. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in thin silver shafts, illuminating the fractured stones and the spectral figures that hovered at the clearing's edge, their translucent hands still outstretched. The 22 fugitives stood in a ragged circle around the half-sunken corpse, the earth beneath it softening as though drinking slowly. Revelation hung heavy in the air, splitting the group like an axe through seasoned wood. Some saw salvation in the apparition's gestures, others glimpsed only a deeper enslavement. Thomas, the blacksmith whose arms had forged the very chains that once bound them, stepped closer to the nearest figure. The entity's face flickered, revealing eyes like polished obsidian that reflected his own scarred torso. When it touched his brow with fingers of cold mist, strength flooded his limbs, the ache of miles vanishing as though burned away. He turned to the others, voice rough with wonder, claiming the power offered would carry them across rivers and past patrols, that the old debt could now shield the living. Gabriel nodded slowly, his massive frame straightening, drawn by the promise of protection for the long road north. Delilah joined them, her earlier faith in ancestors twisting into acceptance of this older, hungrier covenant. But Eliza recoiled, pulling young Ruth and quiet Miriam back with her. The visions pouring from the stones showed not freedom, but an endless cycle, blood for blood, rage feeding rage, the land's thirst never slaked. She saw how the entity had used white greed to harvest suffering, and now sought to bind black fury to the same wheel. Her scarred hands trembled as she warned that accepting this power would chain their souls long after their bodies escaped iron. Silas, whose shoulder still bore Whitaker's brand, hesitated between the two camps, sweat beading on his brow despite the winter chill. The divide sharpened into open conflict. Voices rose, low at first, then edged with desperation. Thomas accused Eliza of cowardice, of dooming them to capture and the gallows. She countered that he bartered their humanity for a phantom strength. Hands clenched into fists, the spectral figures watched without expression, their forms brightening as anger flared. Gabriel tried to calm the storm, but Delilah's knife flashed in the moonlight as she stepped toward Eliza, insisting doubt would betray them all. In the end, words failed. Silas lunged to separate Thomas and another who reached for Eliza, only to catch a wild blow across the temple. He staggered, blood threading down his face, and fell against the altar stone. The impact split skin and skull alike, a dark pool spreading swiftly into the carvings. The apparitions surged forward then, their sorrowful masks twisting into something avid. The clearing trembled, ivy lashed like whips, coiling around ankles. Those who had embraced the power felt it surge through them, hot and intoxicating, while the doubters screamed as shadows thickened, dragging them down into the warming earth. By the time the struggle ended, fewer than half remained standing, breath ragged, eyes wild with triumph or horror. The stones gleamed wetly, the air thick with copper and resin, the spectral chorus rising in exultation as the divide claimed its toll and the ancient hunger fed once more on the fury it had helped kindle. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Georgia Lowcountry 2 days after Christmas, the news of Harlan Whitaker's gruesome death spreading like wildfire through neighboring plantations and into the nearest towns. By midday, a posse of 20 armed militiamen, bolstered by overseers and volunteer slave catchers, had assembled at the Whitaker gate, their hounds baying against the scent of blood frozen into the yard. Shock rippled through the white community. Whitaker had been no saint, but the sheer audacity of 23 enslaved people rising as one, poisoning and dispatching their master in his own dining room, then vanishing into the woods with his corpse, defied every assumption of order. Posters promising rewards went up by nightfall, and the hunt began in earnest. The fugitives, now reduced to fewer than a dozen after the bloody schism in the clearing, pushed northward through dense thickets, guided by the unnatural strength that coursed through those who had embraced the spectral covenant. Their trail was faint, broken deliberately, yet the hounds caught fragments, blood from Silas's fatal wound, scraps of damask cloth snagged on briars. The militia followed relentlessly, torches flickering in the winter gloom, voices sharp with outrage and fear. As the pursuers closed the distance, The woods themselves seemed to shift. Men who had hunted runaways for years found familiar landmarks gone, paths twisting back upon themselves. The lead tracker swore the pines whispered, a low susurrus that set the dogs whining and refusing to advance. One militiaman, a burly overseer named Rawls, laughed it off at first, cracking his whip against trunks to drive the pack forward. Then the voices found him, soft at first, then intimate, naming his own private cruelties, the girl he had flogged to miscarriage, the boy whose eyes he had put out for insolence. His face drained of color, the whip fell from numb fingers. The hounds broke next, scattering with yelps into the underbrush as shadows lengthened unnaturally across the frost. Lanterns guttered though no wind stirred. Men at the rear of the column reported glimpses of tall figures pacing just beyond the light, silent and watchful. Rifles trembled in sweating hands. The posse's commander, a stern planter from Savannah, barked orders to hold formation, but doubt had taken root. When a sudden cry echoed ahead, Rawls stumbling into a sinkhole concealed by ivy, his legs snapping like dry kindling, the line faltered. By twilight, the hunters had become uncertain who followed whom. Footprints they tracked sometimes circled back toward their own camp. The voices grew bolder, threading through the trees in overlapping layers, speaking now to every man, debts unpaid, sins tallied, blood calling to blood. Torches revealed nothing but endless trunks and deepening gloom. The militia pressed on, driven by duty and terror of returning empty-handed, yet each step carried them deeper into a maze where the pursued seemed to dance just out of reach, buoyed by something ancient and vengeful that blurred the boundary between hunter and hunted, turning the pursuit itself into a slow unraveling of certainties in the heart of the whispering woods. The remnants of the posse stumbled out of the woods at dawn on the third day, fewer than half their original number, faces gaunt and eyes hollow with what they could not speak of aloud. Behind them, the pines stood silent again, the whispers gone as though they had never been. The surviving fugitives, now only 7, their bodies thrumming with the borrowed strength of the clearing, emerged far to the north, crossing a swollen river under cover of unnatural fog, footprints vanishing into mud that closed like a mouth. Word spread swiftly through Georgia, a plantation master slain on Christmas morning, his body lost to the wilds, a militia broken by shadows and voices no preacher could name. In taverns and parlors from Savannah to Augusta, the tale grew with each telling. Some claimed the enslaved had conjured devils, others insisted swamp fever had driven the hunters mad. Rewards went unclaimed, patrols refused to re-enter those woods, and the Whitaker land stood abandoned, its fields reverting to briar and pine. Yet the horror did not end with escape or silence. Years later, travelers on lonely roads reported hearing murmurs from the tree line at night, layered voices speaking in tongues both old and new, calling names long forgotten. Children born on nearby farms woke screaming of tall figures at the window, wrists crossed in eternal supplication. Runaways who sought shelter in those pines sometimes vanished, leaving only scattered belongings and earth disturbed as though something had pulled them down. The 7 who survived scattered across free states and beyond, carrying the clearing's gift like a brand beneath the skin. Strength lingered in their limbs, wounds healed too swiftly, dreams came vivid with blood and stone. One by one, they met ends that mirrored the schism. Gabriel found hanged in a Philadelphia alley though no rope had touched his neck. Delilah burned alive in her cabin with doors barred from inside. Thomas walked into a frozen lake and did not rise. Each death fed the distant chorus, a faint echo carried on winter wind back to Georgia soil. The entity beneath the ruined altar stirred with every drop, patient as seasons, binding the original sin of the land to the righteous fury that had answered it. Defiance had broken mortal chains only to forge ethereal ones, threading vengeance into an unending spiral. Newspapers buried the story beneath politics and war, but elders in the quarters knew better, warning young ones never to speak the Whitaker name after dark. The state's shock faded into legend, then into uneasy hush, yet the woods remembered. On certain Christmas mornings, when frost lies thick and the air hangs unnaturally still, hunters swear the pines exhale a low, satisfied sigh. Deep in that forgotten clearing, ivy continues its slow creep over fresh-turned earth, stones gleam with dew that looks too dark in the pale light, and the voices rise once more, not in sorrow now, but in patient anticipation, waiting for the next spark of rage to feed the cycle that began with 23 souls and 1 poisoned feast, a mystery etched forever into the dark heart of Georgia's wilds.